We start in Tonga, where the government has confirmed 3 people died from an undersea volcano and tsunami that thrashed the Pacific nation on Saturday. The government says nearly all the houses on Mango Island are destroyed. And the Prime Minister's office says the satellite phones have allowed for some communication, but most places are still cut off. With clean water a concern there, the government is advising people to only drink bottled water. And the main airport is still closed due to heavy ashfall, hampering international relief efforts. For more on that, let's turn to our correspondent Owen Poland, live in Auckland, New Zealand. Owen, hello there. So first of all, tell us the latest out of Tonga.
Well, within the last 24 hours, the Tongan government has released its first statement since the eruption. And it says it's an unprecedented disaster for the Pacific Island nation, which is home to around 110,000 people. It's understood that the broken undersea communications cable could now take up to 4 weeks to fix. So that's going to make it difficult to assess the full extent of the damage. However, satellite images and photos taken by reconnaissance aircraft over the past day or so have revealed what's been described as catastrophic damage on some islands as a result of the tsunami and the toxic volcanic ash cloud that experts say could create an environmental crisis because of the contamination to food crops and sea life. The Tongan government says that the tsunami waves were as high as 15 metres and they've completely destroyed hundreds of homes and also forced 3 islands to be evacuated. The race is now on to clear a thick film of volcanic ash from the runway on the main island of Tonga Tapu so that emergency flights can bring in much needed aid. In addition to the ongoing threat of more eruptions, a tropical depression is now forming in the Pacific Ocean, and there's a concern that it could develop into a tropical cyclone over the next 48 hours, which is obviously something that Tonga doesn't need right now.
Right, and we understand that it's very difficult for any aid to get in the country, but so far, what international aid has been offered?
Well, a lot of aid agencies around the world are standing by, the United Nations, UNICEF, Red Cross, and so on. And here in New Zealand, a group of high-powered Tongan citizens have got behind a Tonga relief project, including the All Black rugby legend Sir Michael Jones. Starting from tomorrow, people are being asked to bring donations of water and food to a rugby stadium here in Auckland, where they can be packed into containers over the weekend and put on a ship that's leaving for Tonga next week. Meanwhile, 2 New Zealand Defence Force ships have already set sail for Tonga with much needed drinking water and essential equipment, including a helicopter that can deliver urgent aid to the outlying islands. Australia is also sending a ship this week, and China has in the last 24 hours offered to fly in food, water and disaster relief equipment once that airport is opened. The International Red Cross estimates that 80,000 people could be affected by this disaster, and they're standing by to launch an international disaster relief fund. And judging by the extent of the damage so far, Tonga is going to need all the help it can get to get back on its feet.
Indeed. All right. Thank you very much, Owen Poland, reporting from Auckland. And the Chinese ambassador to Tonga says there are no reports of casualties among Chinese citizens. And Cao Xiaolin spoke with China Media Group via satellite phone.
Houses on some of the islands were all destroyed by the tsunami. The exact number of casualties is still being counted. The volcanic ash has contaminated water throughout the country, making drinking water difficult to access. Crops have been devastated. Overall, the country experienced heavy property losses. Volcanic ash is still in the air, which can harm people's respiratory systems. So the government is urging people to avoid going out and wear face masks. The public is complying with the emergency measures, and they are working together to overcome the difficulties. Overall, social order remains in place. After the eruption, the Chinese embassy immediately activated a contingency plan and communicated with relevant departments of the Tongan government. We will spare no efforts to protect the safety of Chinese citizens and other entities in Tonga. There are more than 1,000 Chinese nationals and company employees on Tonga's main island. So far, they are safe, living and working normally. Since communication has been cut off, we asked the Tonga government to help us check out the situation of Chinese citizens on other islands and provide necessary support. Over the past few days, the staff of the Chinese embassy have visited some of the households of Chinese citizens that were seriously affected by the disaster and provided help.
Well, the impact of the tsunami has been felt across the Pacific. In Peru, cleanup is underway after strong waves rocked the ship and caused an oil spill. The Peruvian government said this week that the ship was loading oil into a refinery when it was moved by the waves. At least 2 kilometers of the country's central coast are affected, along with 18,000 square meters of beach. And carcasses of birds, fish and other species have washed ashore. Authorities say the spill is under control now and the investigation is still ongoing. And now let's get a big picture of Tonga and the underwater volcano off its coast. Tonga is a Polynesian archipelago made up of 176 islands southeast of Fiji, and the country holds a population of 100,000, residing on 36 of its islands. And Tonga withdrew from the British protectorate and joined the Commonwealth in 1970. The Hunga Hapapai is an underwater volcano situated about 30 kilometers southeast of Tonga's Vanuatu Island. The scientists say it has been active over the past few decades. Its eruptions in 2009 and 2015 created 2 new land masses. The most recent volcanic flare-up began in December last year with the gas, steam and ash plumes rising about 12 kilometers into the air. Its eruption on January the 14th was followed by another massive blast in the next day, which triggered tsunami waves across the Pacific. For some insight into the eruption, we're now joined by Professor Scott Bryan in Brisbane, Australia. He's a volcanic researcher at the Queensland University of Technology. Professor, welcome to Global Watch. First of all, this volcano eruption of Tonga is believed to be the largest in 30 years, and people have been suffering greatly indeed. So how do you think they should cope with the aftermath, such as the ashfall and the polluted water, etc.?
Thanks. It's good to be with you. It certainly has been one of the largest explosions or volcanic detonations that we've had for quite a long time, perhaps going back to the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, particularly if we use the sonic boom as a measure of how big that eruption was. The damage from the tsunami and from your correspondent before describing is very concerning, but thankfully to date we haven't had mass casualties arising from that tsunami. Some of those coastal areas look very impacted, and buildings and homes have been literally washed away from the first satellite and reconnaissance air photos we've received. So finding shelter and homes for those displaced people is going to be a priority in these early days. The ashfall is also the other main impact from the eruption following the tsunami. And again, from the satellite images and the reports from the main island, that ashfall is quite thick, hindering the runway and the airport reopening. But thankfully, the thickness of the ash doesn't appear to be too great, so that it could collapse the roofs of buildings. If that cyclone does develop and heavy rainfall does come towards Tonga in the next few days, and we have all that ash sitting on the roofs of buildings, then that's going to gain added weight, and wet, heavy ash can potentially cause roof collapses in the days and weeks to come. So it'll be important to try and remove as much of that ash as possible. Right. The other reports about the water supplies being contaminated, that's a real issue. Firstly, the ash being tiny particles is going to make the water look quite muddy, but it's the chemical effects from the ash which are also concerning. The ash can leach, or on the ash particles can be chemicals like sulfur and fluorine, and they can wash out into the water and make it very acidic, and also increase the fluorine content of the water. And if that water is ingested in significant amounts, that could potentially lead to fluorosis issues both in humans and in livestock. So a range of complications to work through in the days to come.
Right, and according to NASA professor, that the power of this eruption is 10 megatons of TNT equivalent, which is 100 times as powerful as the nuclear bomb dropped in Hiroshima. With that great power, do you think we have seen the worst scenario yet? Is there going to be another as big or even larger eruption in the near future?
Good question. I think in this case, these sorts of detonations or explosions, as you described, are incredibly powerful, but they're also quite rare. And I think really the last really big explosion we had like this was Krakatoa in 1883, where the sonic booms were heard as far away in Europe. I think that something happened to cause this explosion on January 15. As you described before, the eruption had actually started back in December 20. So the volcano had been erupting for at least 2 to 3 weeks prior. So something catastrophic happened on that day. And the latest images of the volcano has shown that the cone that had been built up over the last decade has now completely gone. And there's a suspicion that there may have been a landslide on the volcano that depressurized the magma that was sitting in the volcano, but also allowed the seawater to access much more of that magma to then cause this huge boom and explosion that we saw and heard around the world. So hopefully, if there has been a landslide, as destructive as that has been and led to this explosion, hopefully it has helped to stabilize the volcano underwater so that it can prevent any further these very big explosions.
Right, and in 1991, as we reflect, the Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines led to a cooling period globally. How about this one, this eruption in Tonga? Do you think it will likely affect the climate as well?
Possibly. As you described, the Pinatubo eruption had some very important climatic effects. The two key ones were that the tall eruption cloud had injected a lot of sulfur gases or aerosols into the stratosphere, and that those sulfur gases then spread out across the globe, and in the case the whole world, and that basically acted like a shield to the Earth, preventing a lot of solar radiation coming in, and led to global surface cooling of about 0.5 degrees Celsius for the 2 years after the eruption. So that's the years of 1992 and 1993. In this case, the Tonga Haipai eruption was similarly very explosive and powerful, but it was much shorter lived. It was basically one boom, injecting the ash and these gases into the atmosphere and the stratosphere for a very brief time. So the amount of sulfur that has been measured to date is about 40 times less than what we measured in the Pinatubo eruption. So we're going to certainly have very spectacular sunsets in the coming weeks and months as this sulfur gas veil spreads and diffuses and disperses across the stratosphere, particularly in the southern hemisphere. But the amount of sulfur is nowhere near as what we saw with Pinatubo to cause any major climatic shifts or cooling in the months and years to come.
Right. How about the impact on the ocean environment? This eruption took place underwater. Do you think the ocean currents would make the environmental impact a global one, especially to the ecosystem under the sea?
Good question. We certainly saw with the tsunami waves that they basically extended almost entirely across the whole Pacific Ocean, affecting the west coast of the Americas, up into Japan, down to New Zealand and even Australia, as well as locally in Tonga. Thankfully, those tsunami waves have dissipated, but the ocean currents are really not going to transport material too far from the volcano, and certainly not globally. Most of the currents, and certainly the surface currents, will distribute material through the Southwest Pacific region, like we see with the pumice rafts produced by some of these volcanoes in Tonga as well, which drift westward through Fiji and across to Eastern Australia. So any dispersal and oceanic effects would, at this stage, be fairly localised to this region. But from the satellite images, we're not seeing too much material being transported and sitting on the ocean surface that might cause any huge impact to the broader ecosystem. Certainly the ash deposition on and around the islands and that ash washing off onto the fringing coral reefs may have some impact to those shallow marine ecosystems locally. But hopefully at a regional scale, we won't see too much impact from this eruption.
All right. Well, we all know that it's very hard to precisely predict and disasters such as earthquake. How about volcano eruptions? Are there any technologies in development that are able to predict a volcano disruption of this big?
Good question. Predicting volcanic eruptions like earthquakes is really, really difficult. And we certainly can have the technologies to monitor volcanoes and give us indications that something might be about to happen. And particularly we look for earthquakes, which are recording magma moving up towards the surface, gas emissions, and also ground deformation. Often the ground sort of swells and rises in response to magma moving up to the surface. So there are sort of key ways or approaches to how we might identify that a volcano is about to erupt and then forewarn populations and evacuate people from the surrounding areas. The real challenge is, even though we have the technologies to make those measurements, is that there are so many volcanoes in the world, and particularly even more underwater. And it is a very costly exercise to put these sensors on each and every volcano on our planet to then monitor them for impending eruption. That's our biggest challenge.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Professor Scott Brine in Brisbane, Australia, is a volcanical researcher at the Queensland University of Technology. Thank you very much for your insight.